They escorted him out in front of 11 board members, 2 attorneys, and a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the entire Austin skyline. Sylvia Crane didn't ask his name. She didn't look up from her notes when her head of security touched the man's elbow. She registered him the way you register weather: peripheral, irrelevant, already passing. He was wearing a worn canvas jacket, carrying a paper cup from the cart in the lobby, the small size, the one that cost $2.50. He smiled when they asked him to leave, not nervously, not apologetically, just a quiet, private smile that belonged entirely to him. That should have been the signal. It wasn't. 47 minutes later, her phone rang, and the $80 million deal she'd spent 4 months building was already gone. The morning had started the way important mornings often did, with the feeling of something about to be decided. Sylvia woke at 5:43 without an alarm, which happened only when her mind had already started working without her permission. She lay still for a moment in the dark of her apartment on the 28th floor and listened to Austin coming alive below the window. That low city hum that was neither noise nor silence, but something in between. She'd been running Crane Meridian Health for 3 years. She'd taken the CEO chair at 34, 18 months after her mother's diagnosis, in the middle of what the board had diplomatically called a leadership transition, and what Sylvia had privately understood to be a controlled unraveling. The company her mother and father had spent 2 decades building had been one bad quarter away from being absorbed by a larger competitor. Sylvia had stopped that. She'd fought the board members who'd wanted to sell. She'd won. But winning that room hadn't been the end of anything. It had been the beginning of a longer, quieter fight that never fully stopped. Today was supposed to be different. Today was the Alderton meeting. She made coffee in the kitchen the old way, stovetop, in the pot her mother had given her when she'd graduated business school, with a card that said, "This is for the mornings before the big ones." She stood at the window while it brewed and watched the city sort itself into morning and thought about $80 million. She'd said the number so many times in the past 6 weeks that it had stopped being money and started being an equation. Crane Meridian needed capital to expand its outpatient network into 3 new markets. Without it, they were viable. With it, they were something else entirely. Something her parents had always believed the company could be. The Alderton Group wasn't a name that appeared in press releases or conference keynotes. Rowan Alderton didn't do panels. He didn't have a verified social media presence. What he had was a 22-year track record in healthcare investment that other funds referenced, without ever quite explaining how they knew what they knew about him. His reputation existed almost entirely in the careful conversations of people who didn't need to advertise that they'd worked with him. Sylvia had spent 4 weeks preparing. Her team had restructured the pitch twice. She'd personally reviewed the financial modeling until she could walk through it without looking at a slide. Her chairman, Douglas Hugh, had been enthusiastic. "This is the right partnership for where we're going," he'd said over dinner the week before. Alderton money means something in this industry. She'd believed him. She'd believed all of it. The coffee was ready. She poured it into a mug her daughter Rosalind had painted for her at a school ceramics class the previous spring. Uneven glaze, slightly lopsided handle, her name spelled out in blue letters that listed to the left. She held it with both hands and thought about the day ahead. By the time she was in the car at 7:15, she had answered 3 emails and taken 1 call from her CFO, Brennan Cole, who confirmed the presentation room was ready and the catering order had arrived. She told him good. She told him this was important. "Of course," he said, in the tone of someone who had been told things were important many times and believed it every time, which was one of the things she'd always appreciated about Brennan. Crane Meridian occupied the top 3 floors of a glass building in downtown Austin. The lobby had a living wall that Sylvia had approved because her mother had kept plants in every room she'd ever worked in, and the living wall was the closest Sylvia had found to carrying that forward. She arrived at 7:30 and went straight up. Her executive assistant, June Okafor, was already at her desk. She was always already at her desk, precise and watchful with the particular quality of someone who tracked everything and volunteered only what was needed. "Good morning," June said. "You have 35 minutes before prep. The AV is confirmed. Douglas called to say he's 5 minutes out. What's the catering situation?" "The pastry order has the wrong brand muffins." Sylvia set down her bag. "What kind did we get?" "The ones with the blueberry filling. You ordered plain, does it matter?" June looked at her steadily. "It matters to people who notice details before they decide whether to trust you." Sylvia almost smiled. "Fix it." She spent the next 20 minutes at her desk going through the pitch one final time, not because she needed to, because stillness before something large had always made it worse. Her father used to say that preparation was what you did so your hands didn't shake. She wasn't sure she agreed. She'd been perfectly prepared for things that had shaken her anyway, but she kept doing it because the doing was better than the waiting. At 8:10, she walked into the prep meeting. The conference room on 26 was full. Brennan at the table with two analysts, her VP of strategy, three members of the legal team who had reviewed the term sheet twice over the past week. They ran through the presentation in 40 minutes. It was clean. The narrative was solid. The numbers held under every question Brennan threw at her. "You're ready," he said when they finished. She nodded. What she didn't say was, "I've been ready for 6 weeks. I need this to be over." The main conference room on 28 was the best room in the building. East-facing, morning light, a view of the city that on clear days stretched all the way to the hills. Today was a clear day, the kind that felt briefly like a promise. Sylvia arrived at 9:30, 15 minutes before the meeting. She checked the presentation, adjusted 2 chairs, and drank half a glass of water while the room filled. Douglas arrived at 9:48, looking relaxed the way certain men at certain levels had learned to look relaxed as a statement. He made his way around the table, shook hands, settled in at the far end. The Alderton group team was expected at 10 sharp. At 9:56, the conference room door opened. Sylvia was mid-sentence with Brennan when she heard it. A small shift in the room, the kind of recalibration that happens when something unexpected enters a space. She turned. A man stood near the doorway. He was maybe 35, average height. He wasn't wearing a suit. Dark trousers, a simple gray Henley, no jacket. He was holding a paper cup from the lobby cart. He wasn't looking at the room. He was looking out the east windows at the city, with an expression that seemed, if anything, quietly interested. One of the junior associates, a 23-year-old named Kevin, who had been assigned to coordinate the guest list, materialized at the man's elbow. "Can I help you?" The man turned. He had an unhurried face. Not blank, just unbothered. "I'm fine, thanks," he said. "This is a closed meeting," Kevin said with the firmness of someone taking a responsibility seriously. "Are you with the catering company?" Something moved in the man's expression. Not offense. More like a note being made somewhere internal. "No," he said. "I'm not. Do you have a meeting confirmation?" "I don't have a badge." Kevin straightened. "Then I'll need to ask you to wait in reception until—" "Kevin." Sylvia crossed the room, mostly because the meeting was starting in 4 minutes and she didn't need this. She looked at the man and felt something she couldn't place, the sensation of almost recognizing something, like a word on the tip of the tongue. "I'm sorry," she said, using the voice she used when a meeting needed to stay on track. "This meeting is for confirmed guests only. If you're with the Alderton team, we'd need a confirmation from your side." "He's already been cleared," said a voice from the doorway. Sylvia turned. A woman had appeared, late 30s, sharp-eyed, carrying a leather portfolio, and wearing the expression of someone watching a car move slowly toward a wall. "He's cleared," the woman said again. Her name was Teresa Yoon. She was the Alderton Group's senior analyst, and Sylvia had spoken with her twice by phone. Her voice right now was controlled in the specific way of someone working to keep it that way. "Then he's absolutely welcome to." Kevin started. "Kevin." This time it was Douglas at the far end of the table, not looking up from his phone. "Handle it." And Kevin handled it the way a 23-year-old who had been told to handle something handled it. With total commitment to the instruction and no curiosity about whether the instruction was correct. He touched the man's elbow. "Sir, I'll need you to step out. You can wait in the reception area." The man looked down at Kevin's hand, then he looked at Sylvia. By that point, Sylvia had already looked away. Brennan was saying something about the slide order. The clock on the wall said 9:59. She turned back toward the table. She heard the door open. She heard it close. She looked at Teresa Yoon, who was standing very still with an expression Sylvia would spend the next 3 days trying to read. "Mrs. Yoon, welcome. We're ready whenever you are." Teresa looked at her for a long moment, then she walked to her seat. "Mr. Alderton isn't with me," she said quietly. "I'm the analyst. He always arrives separately." The room went quiet in the particular way of rooms where something has been understood too late. Sylvia looked at the door. Something cold moved through her. She ran the meeting anyway. She was good at this. She'd been doing it long enough that she could present on professional autopilot while part of her was somewhere else entirely. She walked through the financials. She answered Teresa's questions cleanly. She made the case for the partnership with precision. Rowan Alderton's empty chair sat at the corner of the table, and no one mentioned it, because rooms like this didn't mention the thing directly. They arranged themselves around it and talked about everything else. At 10:43, her phone buzzed under the table. At 10:45, it buzzed again. At 10:48, June opened the conference room door and caught Sylvia's eye with a look that said, "Now." Sylvia wrapped the presentation with 2 minutes of prepared closing remarks and called a 5-minute break. She was in the hallway before the door had finished swinging closed. June was 2 steps away, holding her phone with both hands. Read this. The email was from Rowan Alderton's office. 5 sentences. The Alderton Group was withdrawing from all discussions regarding a potential capital partnership with Crane Meridian Health, effective immediately. The decision was final. Further inquiries should be directed to their legal counsel. The last line read, "We wish Crane Meridian continued success in its work." Sylvia read it twice. She was aware of her own breathing. Deliberate. The way you breathe when you don't want anyone to see what's happening underneath. When did this come in? 10:41, June said. 41 minutes after the meeting started. 41 minutes since the man in the gray Henley had been walked out with his 250 coffee cup. June. Sylvia's voice was flat and even. What does Rowan Alderton look like? June looked at her. She didn't ask why. She pulled up a profile on her phone, a brief feature from a healthcare trade publication, plain background, a photo that was almost aggressively ordinary, and held it out. Sylvia looked at the photograph. The photograph looked back. She handed June her phone. She stood in the hallway outside a room where 12 people were waiting for her and said nothing for a very long moment. "I need 4 minutes," she said. "You have 3, June said. "After that, people start coming out to find you." Sylvia went to the women's restroom at the end of the hall. She ran cold water over the inside of her wrists, the way her mother had shown her when she was 16 and getting panic attacks before swim meets. "The cold brings you back," her mother had said. "When your brain wants to leave, the cold makes you stay." She stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror. She had spent 4 weeks preparing. She had restructured the pitch twice. She had approved the catering order and reviewed the term sheet and walked a man out of her own conference room without asking his name. The face in the mirror had nothing useful to offer. She dried her hands. She went back in and told the room the meeting was concluded, that there would be follow-up from her office, that she thanked everyone for their time. She said it steadily and without explanation. After everyone filed out, she sat at the empty table for 7 minutes. Douglas came back in at some point. "What happened?" he asked. "We lost the deal." He made a sound of careful surprise, very practiced. "How?" "The presentation was excellent. They withdrew." He sat down across from her and put his hands flat on the table in the gesture of a man performing thoughtfulness. "Did something go wrong with Teresa's questions?" "The presentation was fine, Douglas." "Then we regroup. There are other paths." He patted the table twice. "This isn't over." He left. Sylvia sat with those 4 words, "This isn't over." She didn't know yet why they sat wrong in her chest. She didn't know yet what they were the wrong shape of. She stayed until after 9 that night. After the floor emptied and the building settled into quiet, she sat at her desk and rebuilt the morning the way she used to break down bad races as a teenager. Moment by moment, choice by choice, looking for where the wrong thing had compounded. The man had walked in at 9:56, gray Henley, paper cup. He'd said he was there for the 10 o'clock. Teresa had said he arrived separately. Kevin had touched his arm. She had turned away. There was a version of that morning where she'd stopped, where she'd heard something in his voice, that specific unbothered quality, the absence of the anxiety that people had when they were in the wrong room, and asked, "What's your name?" She hadn't stopped. And now she was sitting alone at 9:15 at night with a dead deal and a company still running on ambition and not enough runway, and the image of a man looking at her from across a conference room with an expression she now understood had not been calm at all. It had been recognition, the specific kind that comes from watching someone do exactly what you expected them to. He had expected to be dismissed. She had not disappointed him. She started looking the next morning. Rowan Alderton had built his fund from a small seed in his early 30s. In 12 years, he'd made it one of the most consistently performing healthcare-focused investment firms in the country. Not the biggest, not the loudest, but in terms of actual outcomes, actual track record, exceptional. He was 38. He had a daughter named Blythe. The few articles that mentioned her were limited to a single profile in an Austin business magazine, which he'd apparently agreed to only because a portion of the proceeds funded a children's reading program. The writer noted that he'd initially declined to participate for 2 months. There was a quote near the end of the profile that Sylvia read twice. "I've never been motivated by being seen as the smartest person in the room. I'm motivated by whether the decision was right. A lot of people spend their whole careers mistaking one for the other." She set the article down. She stood at her office window with her arms folded and looked at the Austin skyline and thought about a man who had walked into her conference room alone with a paper coffee cup, let himself be shown the door, and said nothing to correct anyone. He had known what he was testing. She was beginning to understand what she had failed to show him. She called Teresa Yoon at 2 in the afternoon, 4 rings voicemail. She left a message, composed no panic, saying she hoped they could speak before end of week. Teresa called back 8 minutes later. "Miss Crane," she said. "Nothing else. Thank you for calling. I almost didn't." A pause. "What happened yesterday was not a reflection on you personally. It was a reflection on your company's instincts. I understand that. Do you?" Teresa's voice wasn't unkind. It was the voice of someone who said things because they were true, not to wound. From where I was sitting, the CEO of a company requesting $80 million in capital did not recognize who she was meeting with and did not pause to ask before having him removed. Sylvia breathed. "That's accurate. I relied on my staff to manage something I should have managed myself. It was a mistake." A longer pause. "He came in without introduction on purpose," Teresa said. "He always does, first meetings. He wants to see how a room treats someone who doesn't present as important. Most rooms fail. Yes. Did we fail worse than most?" Teresa was quiet. "Your junior associate was doing his job. The culture around him created the conditions. That's yours to own." Another pause. "What I watched was the moment you turned away. He wasn't watching Kevin, he was watching you, and you were already somewhere else." Sylvia said nothing. "Is there anything I can do?" she said finally. "Probably not. He doesn't reopen what he's closed." A beat. "But he did ask me one thing this morning." Sylvia waited. "He asked whether you called yourself or had someone call for you." Sylvia looked at her own name on her phone screen. Outgoing call. "I called, I know," Teresa said. "I already told him." 3 days later, Brennan came to her office at 4 in the afternoon and closed the door. He only did that when the news was the kind that shouldn't travel. "I've been pulling the Hartwell numbers," he said. Hartwell Capital Advisors had approached them the morning after the Alderton withdrawal. Sylvia had noticed the timing. She had filed it under coincidence and moved on. She was no longer moving on. Brennan put a single sheet of paper on her desk, his handwriting, small and careful. Hartwell's primary backer through 2 shell entities was a holding group called Belvane Partners. Belvane Partners had been incorporated 14 months ago. Its registered agent was a firm that represented, among other clients, their own chairman, Douglas Hugh. Sylvia looked at the page for a long time. "How certain are you?" "I spent 11 hours on this," Brennan said. "I'm certain." The room felt like it had lost some of its air. Outside, Austin was doing what Austin always did, bright, busy, indifferent. And she sat at her desk and tried to hold what she was looking at without letting it rearrange her entirely. Douglas had pushed for the Alderton meeting. Douglas had been enthusiastic. Alderton money means something. And when the deal had fallen apart, Douglas had come back into the room and sat across from her and performed thoughtfulness and said, "This isn't over." He already had Hartwell in place. "Don't tell anyone," she said. "I haven't. Not yet. I need to think." She thought all night. By 6 in the morning, she was at the coffee shop 2 blocks from her building, the one she'd been going to for 2 years. The one with the slightly warped wooden floors and the barista named Cal who made her order without asking because she always ordered the same thing. She was at the window table with her second cup and a legal pad full of handwriting when the door opened. She knew before she looked. Something in the room shifted, that same quality of recalibration she'd felt in the conference room. And she looked up, and Rowan Alderton walked in. He was carrying a paper cup, the large one this time. He crossed to a table near the back without looking at her and sat down across from a girl who had clearly been there waiting for him. Maybe 9 years old, dark curls, a sketch pad pressed to her chest. The girl looked up from the pad when he sat, said something Sylvia couldn't hear, and went back to drawing. He didn't look at Sylvia. She looked at her legal pad. She looked at it for about 90 seconds. Then she made a decision. She got up. She crossed to their table. She stood there until he noticed, which took about 3 seconds, and when he looked up, his expression was the same one she remembered, unhurried, attentive, not cold and not warm. "I owe you an apology," she said. She hadn't planned the words. Not a business apology, a real one. "What happened in that room was wrong, and it was wrong because I was looking at the wrong things. I'm sorry." Something shifted in his face. Not softness exactly, something more complicated than that. "Sit down," he said. She sat. The girl hadn't looked up, but her pencil had slowed. "This is Blythe," Rowan said. He said the name the way people say the names of the things they're most careful with. "Hi, Blythe," Sylvia said. Blythe didn't answer but tilted the sketch pad slightly towards Sylvia, just for a second. On the page was the coffee shop. The counter, the warped floors, Cal behind the bar, the window tables. It was observational and precise and genuinely good. "She draws wherever we go," Rowan said. Not explaining it apologetically, just stating it. Sylvia looked at the bent head over the sketch pad and chose silence, because sometimes silence was more honest than anything she could find to say. She looked at Rowan. I know what my company needs, she said. I know what this deal means. But I'm not here to pitch you. She paused. I think something is wrong inside my company. Something that goes past a bad meeting. And I'm trying to understand the shape of it before I do something I can't undo. He watched her. Why are you telling me? Because you already left, she said. You have no stake in this. So if you tell me what you know, you're telling me because it's the right thing to tell. A silence. Cal called out an order. Someone's chair scraped. The espresso machine hissed. Blythe's pencil moved. Douglas Hugh, Rowan said. The name landed between them like something that had been waiting to fall. He reached out to us 3 weeks before your meeting, Rowan said, through an intermediary. He represented that the deal structure would include an advisory arrangement for a consulting group he had a financial relationship with. He said this was consistent with your company's standard approach. Sylvia was very still. When I arrived that morning, he said, I wasn't only evaluating the pitch. I was evaluating whether what I'd been told about your company was true, and then I had you shown to reception. Yes, he said it without satisfaction, just factually. What Hugh communicated, if it's accurate, means the deal was never going to close on your terms, Rowan said. He was planning to engineer a renegotiation at a late stage that benefited his arrangement, not yours. Sylvia looked at the table, then at him. Can you prove it? I can tell you what I know. What you do with it has to be yours. I mean that. It has to be your business, not mine. She understood the line he was drawing. She understood it was right. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Blythe looked up then and turned the sketchpad toward Sylvia. She had added 2 figures to the drawing, at a table near the window, both leaning slightly forward, 2 coffee cups between them. Is that us? Sylvia said. Blythe studied the drawing with professional detachment. You both have the same serious face, she said. Rowan made a sound that was almost a laugh. Sylvia looked at the 2 small careful figures on the page and felt something shift in the morning. Not the crisis, that was still there, waiting, heavy and real, but something underneath it, some other current. She stood. She picked up her legal pad. I have a lot of work to do, she said. I know, Rowan said. She walked out into Austin, which was cold and clear and fully awake, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she started moving. What she needed was a list. What she had were pieces. She started walking. By the time she'd covered 10 blocks and turned back toward the building, the list existed in her head, off paper for now. Off paper for as long as possible. Brennan's documentation of the Hartwell-Belvane-Douglas chain, Rowan's account of the intermediary approach, the timeline, Douglas pushing her toward Alderton. Hartwell appearing the very next morning like it had been sitting in a waiting room. What she needed, the Belvane connection on paper, something that survived a board vote, something a lawyer couldn't disassemble in 20 minutes. What she did not have, time to be wrong. She went straight to 28 without stopping. June looked up and read her the way she always read her. Block my calendar from noon to close, Sylvia said. Tell everyone I'm at an offsite. You're not at an offsite. I know. June was already typing. Douglas called while you were out. He wants to move up the Hartwell review. Sylvia stopped. When did he call? 7:52. 12 minutes after she'd left for coffee. 12 minutes after Rowan Alderton had presumably also left or been visible leaving. She didn't know how deep Douglas's network went. That was the problem. She was operating in a room she'd thought she knew. Tell him the Hartwell review is on hold pending my assessment. Give him Thursday. Don't explain. She went into her office and closed the door. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk, the deep one, and took out the binder her father had given her the week she took the CEO chair. He'd called it the company Bible. Everything you need if things go wrong. Board structure, override provisions, the specific language about emergency disclosures and the removal of board members under conditions of fiduciary breach. She read for 2 hours. She took notes. She ate a protein bar she found in the same drawer and didn't taste it. At 1, Brennan knocked. You found something else, she said before he spoke. He came in and sat. Douglas has a personal financial management account at Crestline Advisory. It's disclosed in his original board conflict documentation from 6 years ago. Nobody flagged it because it wasn't relevant 6 years ago. And now? Crestline Advisory is a co-manager for the Hartwell Capital Partners Fund. He put a printed page on her desk, different accounts, but they share a compliance officer. Sylvia looked at the page. That's not proof. It's a thread, the kind that has things attached to it. She looked at him steadily. How much access does Douglas have to our internal financial projections? Brennan was quiet for a moment. As chairman, full access, meaning he knew our runway numbers. He knew how badly we needed Alderton. She said it out loud because she'd found that saying things outside her own head made them real in a different way, made them something she could work with instead of just carry. Pull every financial decision Douglas had a hand in over the past 3 years, she said. Every advisory contract, every vendor he recommended, every deal that didn't close, and what happened after. I need the pattern. Brennan nodded. At the door, he stopped. Sylvia, he used her first name, which he reserved for the moments that weren't about work. When this is done, after not during, you should probably think about how he got this far without anyone seeing it. He paused, including you. She held his gaze. I know, she said. He left. She sat with that. It was an uncomfortable thing to sit with, the idea that she'd been the one in charge and she'd missed it. She'd been so focused on the external, the deal, the presentation, the capital, the pitch, that she hadn't been paying enough attention to the room she was already standing in. It was the same thing that had happened in the conference room. She'd been looking at the clock and the slide order, and not at the man standing near the window. She added it to the list. She emailed the company's external legal counsel, a woman named Frances Chu, who had been doing corporate litigation for 23 years and had the manner of someone who had encountered every variety of institutional wrongdoing and had never once been surprised by it. 3 sentences. A request for a call. Frances answered on the first ring. I was expecting to hear from you, Frances said. Sylvia talked for 12 minutes. She laid out the structure, the chain of connections, the timeline, the deal that died, and the replacement that appeared the next morning. She didn't use Douglas's name yet. She said a senior board member, and Frances listened without interruption. When she finished, the line was quiet. How solid is Brennan's financial documentation? Frances asked. He built it. It's solid. The outside investor, the one who told you about the intermediary approach. Do you have that in writing? A pause. I have a first-hand account. Nothing on paper would be better. Frances made a sound that wasn't dismissal, more like cataloging. Here's what I need you to do. Don't confront the board member. Don't let him know you're looking. Make sure Brennan has documented copies held separately from the main system. And get me everything by Friday end of business. She paused. If this is what it looks like, we're talking about fiduciary breach at minimum, potentially securities fraud, depending on the Hartwell paper trail. Securities fraud. The phrase sat in the air for a moment. One more thing, Frances said. Who knows? My CFO, me, and the outside investor, not the details of what I've found. Keep it that way. Every person you tell is a variable you can't control. A pause. You're doing the right thing coming to me now. Nobody is ever certain enough before they start. Something eased slightly in Sylvia's chest. Not relief. Too early for that. But the recognition that she wasn't walking alone through this particular dark. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. This gets messier before it gets cleaner. Frances said it the way people said things they'd seen before. Call me Friday. Sylvia hung up and looked at the clock, 2:54. She'd been at this for 6 hours. She was running on stale protein bar and adrenaline, and something she couldn't quite separate from dread. She picked up her desk phone and called Brennan. I need everything on my desk Friday morning, not afternoon. Morning, I know, he said. I've been at it since noon. A pause. Brennan, thank you for bringing this to me. It's your company, he said simply. This is where it belongs. He hung up. She held the dead phone for a moment. Outside her window, the afternoon light was cutting long and low across the city. She watched it and thought about her mother. Specifically about a morning 11 years ago when Sylvia had made a significant error in a client analysis, the kind that cost 2 weeks and made the team look slow. She'd come to her mother expecting the conversation to be about the mistake. Her mother had sat across from her and said, "Tell me what you understand now that you didn't understand when you made the decision." Sylvia had listed it out. Her mother had nodded. That's what the mistake was worth, she'd said. Now we use it. She was still learning that one. She turned from the window and went back to work. The access logs came from IT at 4:30. The anomalies were in the records for the internal financial forecasting database, the one that held their multi-year projections and deal sensitivity analyses. Documents had been pulled at careful intervals over the past 7 months, not in bulk, not obviously. The way you did it if you knew what you were doing and knew someone was watching. The access credentials belonged to an outside consultant retained by the board 13 months ago. A consultant whose engagement had been approved and championed by the chairman. She wrote down the consultant's name. She checked the time, 11:20. She drove home. She made toast and ate it standing at the counter and stared at the middle distance. She went to bed in her clothes and looked at the ceiling for a while and thought about the shape of what she was carrying. Douglas had been building this for at least 13 months, probably longer. He had used his access and his position and the trust the board had placed in him, trust she had also placed in him, to construct something that served himself at the cost of everything her parents had spent 20 years building. He had used her, He had used the vulnerability of the months after her mother's diagnosis, and the transition year, and her own inexperience in the chair. He had waited and moved slowly and carefully. She thought about that dinner. Douglas across the restaurant table. This is the right partnership. She replayed it now and found 4 things she had missed. Specific things. Moments where a different quality of attention would have caught something that didn't fit. She had been so grateful, she realized, for someone in that room who seemed to be on her side. She fell asleep with the lights on and woke at 5:48 with a dry mouth and a clear head and got up and started again. Thursday, Douglas called twice. She let the first go to voicemail. The second she picked up because not answering twice in one day would read wrong, and she needed him to think the temperature hadn't changed. "Sylvia," he said, with the warmth he reserved for moments he wanted something. "I've been worried about you." The Alderton withdrawal. "I can only imagine." "I'm managing," she said, tired, measured, plausible. Hartwell could be a better fit, honestly. More flexibility in the structure, less complicated. He was selling it the way you sold something that was already yours. "I wouldn't wait too long." She gripped the edge of her desk under the table. "I'm still reviewing the terms." "Of course, but their calendar fills." "Coffee Friday?" "I'll check with June," she said. When she hung up, she sat very still for a moment and said quietly to the empty room something that she didn't say out loud to rooms that had glass walls. Then she went back to work. By Thursday evening, Brennan had the full compilation ready, 104 pages, tabbed. She took it home and read it at her kitchen table with a highlighter and a pen. What came out of those pages was not one thing. It was several things layered carefully on top of each other. Advisory contracts to vendors with quiet board connections. A consulting arrangement paid at double the market rate. A potential acquisition from 18 months ago. Good numbers, strong fit, killed quietly at the board level on Douglas's recommendation that the timing wasn't right. The target company had been acquired 6 months later by a firm that, if you followed the thread far enough, had a co-investment arrangement connected to Douglas's network. He hadn't just set up the Alderton play. He had been running smaller versions of this for years. She set the highlighter down at midnight and looked at her mother's coffee pot on the counter. She went to bed. She set her alarm for 6. She was going to need all of Friday. Frances arrived at 9 Friday morning with her briefcase and the expression of someone who had already read the documents Sylvia had sent the night before. "Okay," Frances said before she sat down. "Here's where we are." She laid it out without softening. What they had was significant but not airtight. Enough to bring to the board. Not yet enough to guarantee the outcome without more. What they needed, either a paper record of the intermediary approach on the Alderton deal or additional documentation tying Douglas to the financial extractions across the full timeline. "The access logs help," Frances said. "If we can establish that Douglas directed the consultant's work, we can argue the access was effectively his. And this acquisition story, if we can show he killed a good deal and profited when someone else made it, that's not coincidence. That's a pattern of conduct." She paused. "The outside investor, can you get a written statement?" Sylvia thought about the coffee shop table. About Rowan saying, "What you do with it has to be yours." I mean that. He hadn't said he wouldn't help. He'd said it had to be hers first. He'd wanted her to carry it to the point where it was real, where she'd built it herself. She thought she'd reached that point. "I'll reach out," she said. "No promises." Frances nodded. A corroborating account from outside the company changes the weight of what we're bringing. The board can act without it, but it shifts the conversation. After Frances left, Sylvia sat at her desk for 10 minutes. She thought about what she would say. She thought about Blythe's sketch pad, the drawing of the 2 figures at the window table. Then she picked up her phone and typed a text to the number Teresa Yoon had called from. She kept it short. "I need 15 minutes if you're willing. Not about the deal. I'll explain when we speak." She put the phone down. It buzzed 4 minutes later. Rowan's reply, "Tomorrow. Same place." 8, she exhaled. She looked at the Friday light through her office windows. Whatever came next was going to be hard, but she'd gotten here herself. She'd built it with her own hands in 72 hours of not enough sleep, and that was going to matter. She put the phone face down and went back to the documents. Saturday morning, she arrived at the coffee shop at 7:50. Cal started her order without looking up. She took the window table and watched the door. Rowan came in at 1 minute past 8, alone. Blythe was presumably at one of the weekend programs she'd mentioned in passing, something about a nature sketching class at the community center. He ordered at the counter, and when he sat down across from her, he looked at the tabbed document she'd set between them and then looked at her face. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough that I think I can prove it." She paused. "I need to ask you something. I need you to know I've built the case without your answer. I'm not asking you to rescue anything." He nodded once. The intermediary who approached you, she said. Is there anything you can give me in writing? Not a legal declaration, just what you observed, documented. Rowan wrapped his hands around his cup. He looked out the window for a moment. The street was doing its Saturday thing, slower than a weekday, more purposeful in a different way. Who's your lawyer? He said. Francis Chu. Something moved in his expression, recognition. Francis is good, he said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. The intermediary's name is Garrett Foss. He represents himself as a deal facilitator. He's been connected to at least 2 other situations I'm aware of where a board member used him to position an investor for an extraction play. He looked at her directly. I can give you a written account. The date, what was communicated, how the approach was framed. Teresa can send it to Francis by end of day. That's exactly what I need. One condition, he said. She waited. You're the one who walks into that board meeting. Not Francis. Not Brennan. You. He held her gaze. You lay it down yourself. She understood what he was asking. She almost said, of course. She stopped herself, because it wasn't of course, and he knew it, and saying it easily would have been the wrong version of the yes. I know, she said instead. I know it has to be me. He nodded. He picked up his cup. They sat in the quiet of the coffee shop for a few minutes, and Sylvia thought about the board meeting waiting on the other side of the weekend. She thought about Douglas at his end of the table with his practiced warmth. She thought about walking in there and putting everything she'd built in front of that room herself. She was afraid. She was going anyway. That was the only kind of courage she had ever believed in, not the absence of the fear, but the decision to move through it. She zipped her bag closed. She stood and looked at Rowan, who was watching her with that quality of attention she'd first seen across a ruined conference room. Thank you, she said. Don't let him leave that room with anything intact, he said. Not as drama, just as the thing he thought was true. She held that for a second. Then she nodded and walked out into the Saturday morning, and the city was cold and clear and fully awake around her, and somewhere on the other side of the weekend was the hardest room she'd ever have to walk into. She was going to be ready. The emergency board meeting was Monday at 10. 6 board members, 2 independent directors, the company's general counsel. Douglas arrived at 10:01 in his charcoal jacket, his usual combination. He made his way around the table with his practiced warmth moving ahead of him like something he'd sent in advance. He looked at Sylvia sitting at the head of the table. Something crossed his face fast, a recalibration, and then the warmth came back. Unusual format, he said. Thank you for coming, she said. She began the way Francis had outlined. Timeline first, pattern before the name. She walked the board through the access logs, the consultant credentials, the document pulls. She presented the advisory contracts. She walked through the acquisition from 18 months ago, killed on Douglas's recommendation, acquired 6 months later by a connected firm, laying it all out neutrally, factually, no adjectives, letting the timeline speak. She heard Douglas shift in his chair. She presented the Hartwell chain, the shell entities, the Belvane connection, the registered agent's ties to Douglas's personal financial management account. I'd like to pause here, Douglas said. Smooth, calibrated. I think there's significant context that's missing, and before, under Section 12, Clause 4 of the company bylaws. Sylvia said without raising her voice, an integrity disclosure by a sitting CEO may not be interrupted by motion until the disclosure is complete. I'd ask you to hold your response until I've finished. She looked at him directly. Thank you, Douglas. The room went very still. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked back at her documents and continued. She presented Rowan's written account last. An external statement from a named investment principal, identifying Garrett Foss, the date of approach, the specific terms that had been communicated, terms that appeared in no version of the deal structure Sylvia had ever prepared or approved. She stopped reading. She set the document down. She looked up at the room. Both independent directors were looking at Douglas. The general counsel had gone still in the way. Lawyers went still when they understood what they were looking at. The board member she'd known longest, a 71-year-old woman named Irene Sato, who'd been on the board since Sylvia's mother had founded the company, was looking at Douglas with an expression Sylvia had never seen on her before. Douglas looked at Sylvia. She saw it happen, the lean forward, the expression calibrating toward wounded reasonableness, the look she'd always read as collegial, as the look of someone in her corner. She saw it now for exactly what it was. She looked back at him and did not look away. These are serious allegations, Douglas said. His voice had lost a fraction of the smoothness. I want to be clear that I take them seriously. But what we have is a set of circumstantial connections and a statement from an unnamed. The statement is attributed to a named principal, Sylvia said. She said it without inflection. Would you like the general counsel to read the attribution? The general counsel, without being asked, said the name aloud from the document. 3 board members looked up from the page at the same time. Irene Sato put down her pen. She looked at Sylvia. Then she looked at Douglas. I think we've heard the disclosure, Irene said. Her voice was quiet and entirely certain. I move to vote. The motion to authorize an independent audit passed 5-1. The motion for Douglas's recusal pending the audit passed 5-1. The one vote against both was Douglas's own. He cast it looking straight ahead, jaw set, the warmth entirely gone from his face, replaced by something that was neither anger nor defeat, but the particular expression of a man watching something he'd built over years being methodically taken apart. When the second vote was recorded, Douglas stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Sylvia. You're making a mistake, he said. The voice under the voice, harder and smaller than the room voice she'd known. I don't believe I am, she said. He left. The door closed. Sylvia stood at the head of the table and felt the room change around the fact of his absence. Board members who had been rigid were exhaling. The general counsel was already writing. Brennan was on his phone. Irene Sato met her eyes from across the table. She said nothing. She gave Sylvia one slow, deliberate nod, the kind that carries more than a sentence, the kind that means, I saw what that cost. It was worth it. Sylvia nodded back. She stood at the head of that table until the room had mostly cleared. Then she sat down because her knees were doing something she didn't want displayed while people were still present. She put both hands flat on the table and breathed. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. She typed a message to Rowan. Board voted. Audit authorized. He was recused. She paused, then she added, I held the room and sent it. She put the phone on the table and looked at the city through the glass. It was mid-morning now. The light was coming through the windows in a long stripe across the table. Her phone buzzed. 3 words from Rowan. I know you did. She looked at it for a long moment. She looked at the empty chairs. She looked at the city outside, already indifferent to what had just happened in this room, already moving on to the next thing. She picked up her bag and walked out. June was at her desk when the elevator opened. I already have Brennan on hold. June said, and Francis is staged for a 1 o'clock. Move Francis to noon, Sylvia said. And the employee message goes out today, not tomorrow. Draft it and bring it to me in 20 minutes. June wrote it down. Anything else? Yes. Sylvia stopped. Rosalind is at school until 3. Will you make sure someone picks her up today? I want her home early. June looked at her, a look that was softer than her usual one. Already called your sister. Rosalind will be home by 3:15. Sylvia stood there for a moment. She felt something move through her that wasn't triumph and wasn't relief. Something quieter than both. Something that lived in the neighborhood of. Still here. Still standing. Still mine. She went into her office and closed the door. She stood at the window for a moment, looking at Austin in its Monday morning motion below. Somewhere out there was a coffee shop with warped wooden floors and a window table where 2 people had sat across from each other on a Saturday morning and had a conversation that was really about what kind of person you were when nobody was watching. She had tried to be that person. She turned from the window, sat down, reached for her phone to call her mother. And as she waited for the line to connect, she looked at the lopsided ceramic mug on her desk. The blue letters listing slightly to the left, the uneven handle, her name in Rosalind's careful 9-year-old hand, and felt for the first time in 3 weeks something that wasn't a strategy or a contingency or a carefully prepared response. It felt like the beginning of the part where the damage started to mean something. Her mother picked up on the second ring. Sylvie, she said, using the name she'd used when Sylvia was small. Talk to me. Sylvia leaned back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the cold water over her wrists in the restroom, and the mirror that had nothing useful to offer, and a man with an unhurried face being walked out of her conference room while she looked at the clock. She thought about a 9-year-old sketch pad and 2 serious figures leaning toward each other over coffee cups. She thought about walking into the hardest room and putting everything she'd built onto that table with her own hands. I'm okay, Mom, she said, and then surprising herself, actually, I think I'm more than okay. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, your father and I built something worth protecting. So did you. Sylvia held the phone. The city moved outside the window. The morning light on her desk was pale and clean. I know, she said softly. I know we did.